The old water pump in the barn, my last sanctuary, wasn't just broken. My own children had turned it into a weapon. That faint, sweet smell I'd chalked up to old pipes was actually the scent of my own slow-coming death. They don't know that I know, and they certainly have no idea what a man with nothing left to lose is capable of doing. The story I'm about to tell, well, it isn't an easy one to hear, but it's my truth. Welcome. I'm glad you're here. If you're listening, do me a favor and hit that like button, and maybe let me know what city you're listening from. I'd sure like to know how far this story travels. It all started on a Tuesday morning, one that felt no different from the 1,000 Tuesdays that came before it. I was up before the sun had made up its mind, my back and knees cracking and popping in a familiar chorus as I swung my legs out of bed. My ritual never changes. First, a cup of black coffee, strong and without sugar, the way it's supposed to be. Then, I head straight for the barn. There haven't been any horses in it for years, not since Martha passed. Now, it's my woodshop. It's my sanctuary. The sharp, clean scent of pine and the faint metallic smell of machine oil. That's what helps me feel like I'm still myself. It's the one place where the world still makes sense. But that morning was different. When I turned the spigot on the utility sink to wash my hands, the water came out in a weak, sputtering trickle. It was barely a whisper. The water pump was acting up again. I let out a long sigh, a familiar cloud of frustration settling over me. It was an old pump, a stubborn beast of cast iron and copper, but it was my pump, and I could always fix it. That was one of the unwritten rules of my life. A man takes care of his own things. He doesn't call for help when his own two hands are capable. I spent the better part of the morning wrestling with that damn thing. Everything felt heavier than it used to. The pipe wrench, an old friend, seemed determined to slip from my calloused grip, its metal teeth refusing to bite down. I remember a time, maybe just a few years back, when I could have lifted the whole motor assembly out of its housing without a second thought. Now, just bending over to tighten a bolt sent a sharp, stabbing pain through my lower back, a hot reminder of the 68 years I'd lived. My DeWalt toolkit lay open beside me on the concrete floor. Those bright yellow and black tools had been loyal companions for decades, helping me build shelves for Martha, a treehouse for my son Michael, and countless pieces of furniture that filled our home. But today, they felt like they were mocking me, silent witnesses to my growing weakness. I wiped a bead of sweat from my brow with the back of my forearm, trying to ignore a wave of dizziness that was starting to creep in at the edges of my vision. "You're just getting older, Arthur," I told myself, my inner voice gruff and impatient. But I knew, deep down in my bones, that this felt different. This was a deeper kind of exhaustion, a weariness that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with something being fundamentally wrong. That's when Michael walked in, holding 2 sweating bottles of beer. He always had a knack for showing up at just the right moment. "Still fighting the good fight, Dad?" he asked, his voice laced with a kind of gentle pity that always rubbed me the wrong way. He took one look at me, then at the mess of tools scattered around the pump. "You should take a break. Let me have a look." He fiddled with it for a minute, tightened a few nuts that I'd already tightened, and then shook his head, a look of performative defeat on his face. "I think this thing needs more than we've got, Dad. Maybe it's time to call a professional?" I hated that suggestion. Calling a repairman felt like raising a white flag. It was an admission of failure, a confession that I was no longer the man I used to be. "I can handle it," I said, the words coming out as a low growl. Michael placed a hand on my shoulder, a gesture that was meant to be comforting, but felt heavy, patronizing. "I know you can, Dad. Of course you can, but why kill yourself over it? There's a new guy in town, a fella named Frank, supposed to be the best. Let me just give him a call for you, okay? The fight just drained out of me then. The exhaustion, the deep, bone-weary fatigue, won the battle my pride had been waging all morning. I gave him a short, reluctant nod. While we waited, I tried to tidy up the workshop. My eyes fell on a stack of beautiful oak planks I'd set aside. I'd been planning to build a rocking chair for my daughter Linda, a real one with a smooth, curved back and sturdy arms. I reached down to lift one of the heavier boards, and suddenly the room tilted violently. The scent of sawdust and oil swirled around me as the world blurred into a dizzying smear of brown and gray. I shot my hand out, my palm slapping hard against the cold steel table of my saw, just barely keeping myself from pitching headfirst into the nest of sharp blades below. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I stood there for a long moment, gripping the edge of the saw, taking deep, ragged breaths until the world righted itself. When Linda came in a minute later to ask if I was all right, I just waved her off. "Fine, honey, just a little tired." I couldn't let her see. I couldn't become a burden. That's the one thing a man is never allowed to be. I had no idea, not then, that my silence was exactly what they wanted. Frank, the repairman, wasn't what I expected. He didn't barge in with a loud greeting and immediately get to work. After a polite handshake, he just walked around the barn. He had a strange, observant way about him, his eyes scanning the rafters, the walls, the dusty windows. He asked me about the ventilation system, about the age of the electrical wiring, questions that had absolutely nothing to do with a broken water pump. "Michael told me you had all the latest equipment," I said, a hint of impatience in my voice. Frank nodded slowly. "That I do, Mr. Harrison. But sometimes the problem isn't with the machine." He opened his toolbox, but the first thing he took out wasn't a wrench or a screwdriver. It was a small, handheld device, a digital meter of some kind that looked like it was for testing air quality. A vague, unsettling feeling began to crawl up my spine. He spent a long time hunched over the pump. I could hear the quiet clinking of metal on metal, the sound of his low, solitary mumbling as he worked. Then, suddenly, it all stopped. The barn fell silent. He emerged from the dark corner where the pump was housed, wiping his hands on a clean rag. The easy-going look he'd had when he arrived was gone, replaced by something more serious, more focused. He looked me straight in the eye, a gaze that felt like it was searching for something deep inside me. "Mr. Harrison," he began, his voice dropping low. "Forgive me for asking a personal question, but have you been feeling different lately? Any weakness, aches, or pains you can't explain?" His question hung in the dusty air between us. It felt like a stone dropped into a still pond, sending ripples out that I couldn't yet understand. It wasn't the question of a repairman. It was the question of a man who had already seen something I hadn't. A hot flash of anger surged through me, sharp and defensive. "What in the hell does my health have to do with the water pump?" I snapped, my voice harsher than I intended. "You're here to fix the plumbing, not play doctor." Frank didn't flinch. He didn't react to my anger at all, which somehow made it worse. He just stood there, his expression calm and serious, and held out a small piece of metal in his palm. It was a strange little contraption, a small disc with a few thin, delicate wires attached to it. "I found this clamped onto your water line, Mr. Harrison, just before the intake. This isn't part of any standard pump assembly. It was custom made." I stared at the object. It looked intricate, alien. My first instinct was pure disbelief, a desperate grasp for a rational explanation. It's probably from the old owners," I stammered, the excuse sounding weak even as it left my lips. "This farm has been around a long time. Could be anything." I didn't believe it. The metal was too clean, the wires too new. There was no rust, no sign of age, but the alternative was too monstrous to consider. Frank slowly shook his head. "It's brand new, sir. The soldering is fresh. And there's something else." He motioned for me to follow him, and my feet felt like lead as I crossed the concrete floor of my own barn, a space that was suddenly beginning to feel foreign and hostile. He led me over to the old ventilation system near the back wall, a network of ducts I hadn't paid much mind to in years. He pointed up at a small metal box, expertly tucked behind a mesh grate, almost invisible in the shadows. "This is connected to a timer and a small canister," he said, his voice low and even. "It's set to release a fine, odorless, colorless aerosol at timed intervals. Both this device and the one on your water pipe are wired to the same power source. The installation, it's very professional." My heart, which had been a low drumbeat of anxiety, began to pound against my ribs. This was no coincidence. 2 devices professionally installed, hidden from sight. This was a system. This was a plan. My mouth was dry. "What are you implying?" I asked, though a cold, sick certainty was already forming in the pit of my stomach. "I'm not implying anything, Mr. Harrison," Frank said, his voice firm, leaving no room for doubt. "I'm telling you that someone is intentionally, systematically poisoning you." The word, poisoning, hung in the dead air of the barn. It sounded absurd, insane, a plot from a cheap television movie, not something that happens in a quiet town, in a man's own workshop. Poisoning me? Who would do something like that? I nearly shouted, the words tearing from my throat. And then, for a horrifying split second, an image flashed through my mind. Michael, holding out a beer, Linda, handing me a cup of tea. I shoved the thought away with such violence it made me physically recoil. It was impossible, unthinkable. They were my children. My children. I taught them about honor. I taught them the value of a hard day's work. I taught them to be good people. This couldn't be happening. "Get out," I said, my voice shaking with a rage born of pure terror. "Get out of my barn. I don't want to hear another word from you." Denial was the only shield I had left. It was a thin, flimsy barrier against a truth so devastating it threatened to shatter my entire world. But Frank didn't leave. He just took a step back and sat down on a wooden crate, his gaze full of a weary sympathy that I couldn't bear. "My father," he began, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "He passed away in a similar way. Everyone just thought he was getting old and clumsy. He'd fall down the stairs, burn himself with hot water. You know, little accidents that kept adding up. It wasn't until it was too late that we found out his new wife had been putting sedatives in his coffee every morning. All she wanted was the house." His story hit me like a bucket of ice water. He wasn't guessing. He wasn't speculating. He was recognizing a pattern. He was seeing the ghost of his own father standing right in front of him. He was seeing him in me. As he spoke, the disjointed, confusing fragments of the past year began to click into place in my mind, forming a picture of terrifying clarity. The joint pain that was always worse in the mornings. The bone-deep fatigue that clung to me no matter how much I slept. The slight, persistent tremor in my hands that made it hard to hold a coffee cup steady. The near falls in the workshop, dismissed as simple clumsiness. Michael's constant casual remarks about how I needed to be more careful. The mug of herbal tea Linda brought me every single night, insisting it was good for an old man's sleep. Every single thing I had attributed to the slow, inevitable decline of old age was suddenly cast in a new, demonic light. These weren't the symptoms of aging. They were the results of a quiet, patient, and relentless assault. This was violence, carried out not with a fist or a weapon, but with a quiet hiss from a hidden vent and a slow drip into the water I drank every day. The strength went out of my legs. I stumbled backwards and collapsed onto the unfinished oak rocking chair, its hard edges digging into my back. My hands, the same calloused hands that had built houses, fixed engines, and held my children when they were small, were now shaking uncontrollably in my lap. The barn, my sanctuary, the one place on earth I felt strong and useful, was no longer a workshop. It was their laboratory. They had turned my sacred space into a pre-dug grave. The truth didn't just hurt, it eviscerated everything I was, everything I believed myself to be. My legacy, my pride as a father who had raised his children right, my entire identity, it all crumbled into dust in that single horrific moment. I looked up at Frank, this stranger who had just handed me the wreckage of my life. I tried to speak, but no words came out. There was nothing left to say. There was only the silent, burning trail of tears cutting paths through the grime on my old, weathered face. After Frank left, after he promised me he'd stay quiet and find a way to help, I knew I had to do the hardest thing I'd ever done in my life. I had to put on a mask. I had to walk back into that house, face Michael and Linda, and pretend that my world hadn't just been burned to the ground. The stoicism, the quiet, reserved nature that I had worn like a second skin my entire adult life, it was no longer just a personality trait. It was now a tool for survival. I walked into the kitchen. The warm, familiar smell of garlic sizzling and olive oil filled the air. Linda was at the stove, humming a little tune. It was a picture of domestic peace, a scene from a life I no longer lived. "Did Frank get the pump fixed, Dad?" she asked, her voice as sweet and clear as a bell. I just nodded, forcing the muscles in my face to stay relaxed. "Yeah, just, stuck relay." The lie came surprisingly easy. I was playing a part now, the part of the clueless old man, and I had to give the performance of a lifetime. That evening, right on schedule, Linda brought me a steaming mug of tea. "Ginger and lemongrass, Dad, to help you sleep," she said, placing it on the small end table next to my lazy boy. That recliner was my command center, the place where I watched the evening news and read the paper. For years, that simple act of her bringing me tea had been a source of quiet comfort, a sign that I was cared for. But now, as I looked at the steam curling up from the mug, all I saw was betrayal. I could almost feel the invisible chemical molecules dissolving in the hot water, a potion designed to dull my senses, to weaken my body, to slowly, patiently erase me. I waited until her back was turned, until I heard her moving around in the kitchen. Then, with a hand that I willed to be steady, I carefully poured the entire contents of the mug into the potted fern beside my chair. That poor plant probably wouldn't last the week. Neither would I, if I wasn't careful. A little later, Michael sat down in the armchair across from me, pretending to watch a baseball game on the television. "How you feeling, Dad? Back still giving you trouble?" he asked, his eyes fixed on the screen. It wasn't a question of concern anymore. It was an assessment. It was an engineer checking on his project. He was gathering data, trying to determine how effectively his system was working. "Same as always," I replied, keeping my voice a low, even rumble. "Just part of getting old." I could feel his gaze flick over to me for a split second, evaluating my posture, the way I shifted in my chair. I wasn't his father anymore. I was an experiment, a specimen to be observed. The feeling of being hunted in my own home, in my own chair was a new kind of terror, a suffocating weight that settled deep in my chest. I couldn't sleep that night. I just lay in bed, staring at the familiar shadows on the ceiling as a lifetime of memories flooded my mind. I remembered working double shifts down at the mill so Michael could go to a state university so he wouldn't have to break his back the way I did. I remembered selling my old Ford pickup. God, I loved that truck, to help Linda with the down payment for her wedding because I wanted her to have the perfect day. I had spent my entire life building a foundation for them, a solid place from which they could launch their own lives. And now they were using that very foundation to bury me. Their ingratitude was a poison far more potent than whatever was in the water. It was a slow-acting acid that dissolved my soul, leaving me to wonder over and over where I had gone so wrong. The next morning, Michael offered to help me move a heavy oak log in the workshop. "Let me get that, Dad. You'll throw your back out," he said, that same fake concern dripping from every word. I wanted to tell him to go to hell, but I knew that would raise suspicion. I had to keep playing the part. As we lifted the log together, I felt his grip shift, a deliberate loosening of his fingers. The heavy timber slid sideways, grazing my leg before thudding to the concrete floor. It missed crushing my foot by an inch. Maybe less. "Oh, Dad, I'm so sorry. It just slipped," Michael said, his voice a perfect imitation of panicked regret. But I saw it. For just a fraction of a second, I saw the flicker of something in his eyes, a flash of cold, calculated disappointment. It wasn't an accident. It was a test. It was an attempt. That was it. The slip was the final piece of evidence I needed. I couldn't stay here. This house wasn't a home anymore. It was a trap and the walls were closing in. I had to get out. That evening, after they had gone to bed, I slipped out to the barn and used the old rotary phone I kept on my workbench. My hands trembled as I dialed Frank's number from a faded business card he'd left. "Frank, it's me, Arthur," I whispered, my voice hoarse, terrified that even the walls had ears. "I need your help. I have to get out of here, now." To his credit, he didn't ask a lot of questions. His voice was calm and decisive. "Tomorrow morning, 5 a.m., end of the dirt road by the old oak tree. Be ready, and don't bring much." After I hung up, I stood in the doorway of the barn and looked back at the house, its windows dark and silent. I had lived nearly my whole life within those walls. Leaving it felt like sawing off a limb. But I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that if I stayed, I wouldn't just lose the house. I would lose everything. I didn't pack much. A man on the run travels light. A few changes of clothes, my wallet, the essentials. But there was one thing I could not leave behind. Martha's little wooden box. It's not fancy, just a simple pine box I made for her years ago. It doesn't hold expensive jewelry or heirlooms. Inside are the things that were priceless to her. A faded ribbon, a smooth stone from a beach we visited on our honeymoon, a lock of hair from each of the kids when they were toddlers, and a stack of letters I wrote to her from basic training, tied together with a string. I opened the lid and picked up a small, dog-eared photograph. It was of Michael and Linda, maybe 5 and 7 years old, sitting on the porch steps, grinning at the camera with missing front teeth. They were my whole world then. In that moment, I realized my mission had changed. I wasn't just saving myself anymore. I was saving this memory. I was protecting the innocent children in this photograph from the monsters they had become. I gently placed the photo back inside and closed the lid. The small brass latch clicked shut with a dry, final sound that echoed in the silent room. This wasn't me running away. This was a rescue mission, an evacuation of the last remnants of my honor. Next, I pulled on my old Carhartt work jacket. That coat has been with me through 20 winters and 100 construction sites. The heavy canvas is frayed at the cuffs, the shoulders are faded from the sun, and it carries the permanent, ingrained scent of sawdust and machine oil. To me, it's more than just a piece of clothing. It's a uniform. It's a reminder of the man I used to be, a man who was strong, reliable, a man who built things that lasted. As I zipped it up, the familiar weight on my shoulders felt like a suit of armor. I felt a sliver of that old strength return. Tonight, this jacket wasn't just shielding me from the cold night air. It was hiding the trembling of a frightened old man, giving me the courage to do what had to be done. I wasn't building houses anymore. I was trying to save my own foundation from collapsing completely. Leaving my bedroom, I moved with a silence I didn't know I possessed. The oak floorboards, the very same ones I had measured, cut, and nailed into place 30 years ago, seemed to groan under my weight, each creak a potential betrayal. My heart hammered against my ribs with every noise. From the living room, I could hear the faint, tinny sound of the television Michael had left on. From the bedroom down the hall, I could hear Linda's soft, steady snores. They were sleeping soundly, completely unaware that their prey was about to slip the cage. I moved down the hallway, a gauntlet of smiling family photos on either side. There was a powerful urge to stop, to look at their faces one last time, to try and find the people I once knew. But I forced myself to keep moving. That past was dead. All that mattered now was the future, an unknown and dangerous road stretching out before me. I always had a habit of leaving the back door unlocked. It's a country thing, a holdover from a time when you trusted your neighbors and didn't live in fear. The irony was thick enough to choke on. The very habit that spoke of trust was now my only path to freedom. My hand rested on the cold brass doorknob. I took a deep, steadying breath, bracing myself for the frigid air outside. In that moment, turning that knob, I knew there was no going back. The man who owned this farm, the man who had built this life, Arthur Harrison, was dying tonight. The person stepping out into the darkness was just a survivor, a refugee fleeing his own bloodline. I turned the knob, pulled the door open, and the night swallowed me whole. The dirt track leading away from the farm felt a mile long. Every step was heavy, an effort of will. I didn't dare use a flashlight, relying on the faint sliver of a moon to feel my way through the darkness. The wind was sharp and cold, whistling through the bare branches of the trees with a sound like a ghostly whisper. I kept my eyes fixed forward, focused on the massive silhouette of the old oak tree that stood like a silent sentinel at the end of the road. And then I saw it. A brief, low flash of headlights, on for a second, then off. It was Frank's signal. He was here. He had come. A wave of relief so powerful it almost buckled my knees, washed over me. I wasn't alone in this anymore. I picked up my pace, my worn-out boots crunching on the frozen ground, moving toward that small, fleeting promise of hope. It was an old Ford F-150, the kind a working man drives with a few dings in the side and an honest layer of dust on the dashboard. Frank leaned over and pushed the passenger door open for me. "Get in, Arthur," he said, his voice a low rumble. I slid onto the cold vinyl seat, and the exhaustion of the last 48 hours hit me like a physical blow. Frank didn't say another word. He just put the truck in gear and pulled away, driving me away from the only home I'd ever known. We drove in silence for a long time. I watched in the side mirror as the farmhouse grew smaller and smaller until it was just another dark shape that finally disappeared around a bend in the road. "Thank you, Frank," I said, my voice raspy and broken. He just nodded, his eyes on the road ahead. "Real men have to look out for each other," he replied. "That's the code." Frank didn't take me to his house. Instead, We pulled up to a large corrugated steel warehouse on the industrial outskirts of town. He unlocked a heavy sliding door, and the familiar, comforting scent of sawdust, oil, and metal washed over me. It was his workshop, but this place was different from my barn. It was clean, meticulously organized, and most importantly, it felt safe. Tools hung in perfect order on a large pegboard wall. Lumber was neatly stacked according to size and type. In the center of the vast space sat a heavy-duty workbench with a brand-new-looking set of Milwaukee power tools arranged on it. "You can stay here for a few days," Frank said, his voice echoing slightly in the big room. "No one will think to look for you here." He pointed to a worn but comfortable-looking sofa in a corner, next to a small dorm fridge. "There's water and some sandwiches in the fridge. Get some rest." For the first time in what felt like an eternity, I felt my shoulders relax. I felt like I could take a full, deep breath without fear. After I had settled onto the sofa, my aching bones grateful for the rest, Frank pulled out his phone and walked over. He handed it to me. On the screen were the pictures he'd taken in my barn, crystal clear images of the timer and the chemical canister hidden in the vent. A close-up of the strange custom-made device clamped to the water pipe. Seeing them there, displayed in the cold, unforgiving light of a digital screen, erased any lingering shred of doubt. This wasn't the paranoid fantasy of an old man. This was the cold, hard proof of a murder plot. "I already uploaded these to a secure email account," Frank said, his practical tone cutting through my shock, "just in case they try to get rid of the evidence." He had the foresight of a good carpenter. Measure twice, cut once. We sat in silence for a while, the only sound the chirping of crickets outside the thin metal walls. "I told you about my father," Frank said suddenly, breaking the quiet. "But I didn't tell you all of it." His gaze was distant, fixed on a memory. I saw the bruises on his arms, but he always said he'd just bumped into something at work. I saw him getting more and more confused, but I chalked it up to old age. I was right there, Arthur. I was living my own life, too busy to really look. By the time I put the pieces together, it was too late. He stopped, swallowing hard against an old grief. "I'm not going to let that happen again," he said, his eyes meeting mine. "Not on my watch, not to you." His confession forged a bond between us then, a connection built on shared pain and a silent understanding that felt stronger than blood. "So what do we do now?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Frank stood up and began to pace, the way a man does when he's working through a problem. "The pictures aren't enough," he said, thinking out loud. "They'll just say you planted the devices yourself to frame them. It becomes the word of an old, confused man against his two loving children. In front of a judge, that's a tough sell." He stopped pacing. "We need something undeniable, a sample of the chemicals they're using, or better yet, a confession." The thought of that made a cold shiver run down my spine. How could we ever get that? "I don't know yet," Frank admitted honestly. "But first things first, you need to disappear completely. Let them think you've left in a fit of anger. They'll get comfortable, they'll drop their guard, and that's when we'll make our move." Frank poured me a cup of hot coffee from a large thermos. It seemed he was a man who was always prepared. "Drink this," he said. "It's going to be a long night." I took the heavy ceramic mug, its warmth seeping into my cold, tired hands. Staring at this man, practically a stranger, who was risking God knows what to help me, I couldn't help but think about the strange turns a life can take. Sometimes, the people you'd bet your life on, the ones you raised and sacrificed for, end up being the ones who push you off the cliff. And sometimes, the person you least expect is the one who shows up with a rope. Thinking about my situation, I have to wonder, Has there ever been a time in your life when someone, a friend, a coworker, maybe even a neighbor you barely knew, stepped up and helped you through your darkest moment in a way you never saw coming? I'd truly like to hear your story in the comments below. In the corner of Frank's shop, I noticed a small lawnmower engine disassembled on a piece of plywood. It looked like a project he'd been in the middle of. While Frank stepped outside to make a quiet phone call, I found I couldn't just sit still. The nervous energy was too much. I walked over to the engine, my curiosity getting the better of me. I picked up a Champion spark plug from the bench and examined it, the familiar heft of it feeling right in my hand. My fingers were still not as steady as I'd like, but the muscle memory, the deep, ingrained knowledge of how a machine works that never fades. Almost without thinking, I started wiping down the parts with a clean rag, laying them out in a logical order on the workbench. It wasn't a conscious decision. It was an instinct, a reflex. When Frank came back inside and saw me, a socket wrench now in my hand, he didn't say anything. He just watched me for a moment, and a small, knowing smile touched the corners of his mouth. He understood. He knew that for a man like me, fixing something that was broken was the only way I knew how to start fixing myself. The first 2 days in Frank's workshop passed like a slow-motion nightmare. Time stretched and warped. A minute felt like an hour. An hour felt like a day. During the daylight hours, I tried to keep my hands busy, helping Frank with whatever small tasks he had. I cleaned carburetors, sharpened blades, organized sockets. But my mind wasn't there. It was miles away, back at the farm. I felt like a ghost, haunting the rooms of my own house, listening, watching, waiting. Frank was my eyes and ears. He drove by once a day, using the excuse that he'd left a tool behind. He came back with reports that were both reassuring and deeply unsettling. "Everything looks normal," he'd say. "Your truck hasn't moved. No police cars. It's quiet." Too quiet. They hadn't reported me missing. They hadn't called the neighbors. Their silence was more damning than any accusation. It meant they were waiting. Maybe they thought I'd had a fit, stormed off, and would eventually come crawling back. Or maybe, and this was the thought that kept me awake at night, maybe they were hoping I'd have an accident out there on my own. On the third day, the call came. Frank was working on a wiring harness when his phone rang. He looked at the screen, then looked at me, his eyes telling me everything. He put the call on speaker. Michael's voice filled the workshop, dripping with a carefully rehearsed fraudulent concern. "Frank, it's Michael Harrison. Hey, listen, I know this is a long shot, but you haven't seen my dad, have you? You were the last one to talk to him, and he's just gone." Frank played his part perfectly. He sounded surprised, a little confused. He told Michael he hadn't seen me but promised to keep an eye out. After he hung up, he looked at me, his face grim. "The show's beginning," he said. I knew. I could picture them perfectly in my mind, standing in the kitchen, going over their script, deciding what to do next. They weren't worried about me. They were worried about their plan. My well-being was just an obstacle standing between them and the farm. Frank had a buddy who worked as a teller at the town's credit union. He asked him to discreetly look into a few things. The information he came back with felt like another knife twisting in my gut. Michael was deep in debt to a bookie over in the next county, gambling, and Linda, after a nasty divorce a year ago, was left with next to nothing. The farm, my farm, the piece of land that Martha and I had poured our sweat and savings into for 40 years. It wasn't our legacy to them. It was a lifeline. It was a financial solution. They didn't see the porch swing where they grew up or the tree where I carved their initials. They saw acreage. They saw dollar signs. They didn't want to take care of their father. They wanted to liquidate his assets. That night, sleep was impossible. I lay on that lumpy sofa, staring into the darkness, my mind racing. I thought about what they would do after I was gone, after their plan succeeded. They would sell my tools, the DeWalts and Snap-ons that I knew as well as my own hands. They would sell the John Deere riding mower I was so proud of. They would haul my lazy boy, the one perfectly molded to my body, to the dump. A man's entire life, everything he'd worked for, everything he'd loved, everything he'd built, boxed up and sold off at an estate sale over a weekend. The thought filled me with a rage so pure and cold it burned away the fear. For the first time in days, the fear took a back seat. I wasn't just fighting for my life anymore. I was fighting for my soul. Late that night, Frank decided to take another drive, just to get a look at the property from a distance. He came back an hour later, his face etched with worry. "There are lights on in the barn," he said, his voice urgent. "They're in there, Arthur. I think they're taking it all apart." Of course, they were smart enough to know that the hidden devices were the only physical evidence that could ever be tied to them. They weren't just waiting. They were cleaning up. They were destroying the crime scene. Our window of opportunity was closing fast. With every minute that passed, the truth was being ripped out and buried somewhere on that farm. We had to move before it was gone for good. "I have an idea," Frank said, stepping back inside, his eyes sharp and focused. A spark of defiance lit them up. "I'm going to call Michael back in the morning. I'll tell him I need to stop by to finalize the warranty paperwork for the new pump. I'll say it's some new company policy, that I need the homeowner's signature on the official form." It was the perfect lie. It was mundane, believable, and it gave him a rock-solid reason to get back inside that barn. "While I'm there," he said, looking straight at me, "you need to be ready. Because after I make that call, things are going to start moving very, very fast." I nodded, my heart pounding a steady, determined rhythm against my ribs. The waiting was over. It was time to walk back into the storm. Frank dialed Michael's number. I sat on the edge of the sofa, my hands gripping my knees, holding my breath as the phone rang. Michael picked up on the third ring, and his voice was clipped and irritable. "Yeah?" When Frank calmly explained the reason for his call, this business about new warranty paperwork, I could hear the suspicion in Michael's voice instantly. "Warranty? Why now? My dad's not even here." I held my breath. Frank's tone didn't change. It was the steady, unbothered voice of a professional just doing his job. "I understand that, Michael," he said smoothly. "But it's a new policy from the manufacturer. If we don't get the homeowner's signature on file, they won't cover any future repairs. I'm just trying to make sure your father is protected down the line." The angle was brilliant. By framing it as protecting my own interests, Frank had backed him into a corner. To refuse would look suspicious. I heard Michael let out an exasperated sigh on the other end of the line. "Fine, whatever. Come on by, but make it quick." I couldn't go with him. The waiting was a special kind of hell. I sat in the silent workshop, my mind painting a vivid, torturous picture of every move Frank was making. I saw his F-150 crunching up the gravel driveway. I saw him getting out, his work boots hitting the familiar dirt. I saw him walking toward the barn, where I knew Michael would be waiting, his arms crossed, radiating impatience. When Frank got back, he confirmed it all. He said Michael was wound tighter than a guitar string, constantly glancing at his watch. My son, so eager to get back to the business of erasing me. Frank said the whole farm felt wrong, thick with a heavy, guilty silence. Linda had peeked out the kitchen door, her face pale, then vanished back inside like a frightened mouse. Frank, playing his part, pretended to double-check the pump installation, meticulously filling out a clipboard with feigned seriousness. He deliberately dragged his feet, making a show of being thorough. Then he made his move. "You know, he said casually, as if the thought had just occurred to him. While I'm here, I should probably snap a picture of the serial number on that ventilation unit, just for the file. He told me Michael's jaw tightened, but he was so desperate to get Frank out of there that he just gave a sharp, irritated nod. As Frank climbed the stepladder, clipboard in hand, he saw it. In their rush to dismantle their system, they had made a mistake. They'd pulled out the metal box and the canister, but a single, small, bright blue wire they had used to tap into the main power was still poking out from behind the corner of the grate, a tiny, insignificant detail to them, a thread of hope for me. They hadn't been careful enough. Just as Frank was packing up to leave, the second piece fell right at his feet. Linda came out of the back door of the house carrying a full kitchen trash bag, probably on her way to the large bins by the road. She saw Frank and visibly flinched, her surprise causing her to lose her grip. The plastic bag slipped, and a few items spilled out onto the dirt. One of them was a small, unlabeled glass vial that rolled across the ground, coming to a stop just an inch from the toe of Frank's work boot. She gasped, scrambling to gather everything, stuffing it back into the bag while stammering an apology. She practically ran back into the house. But Frank had seen it clearly. It was a laboratory vial, and through the clear glass, he could see it wasn't empty. There was still a small amount of clear liquid sloshing around in the bottom. The thread hadn't just been exposed. It was now tied to a confession in a bottle. Frank walked back into his workshop an hour later, and I could see it on his face before he even said a word. The weariness was gone, replaced by the sharp, focused energy of a hunter who has his quarry cornered. "We got him, Arthur," he said, his voice low but electric with excitement. "They got sloppy." He told me everything, the blue wire, the dropped vial. It was all I could do to just sit and listen, my mind struggling to process the shift. The photos he'd taken before were damning, but they were circumstantial. A smart lawyer could have argued I'd planted them, but that wire, if it matched the wiring on the device he'd found on the pump, and that liquid, if a lab analysis could identify it, that was physical proof, cold, hard, and undeniable. They had gotten careless and handed us the murder weapon. The suffocating blanket of helplessness that had been smothering me for days finally began to lift, replaced by a strange and unfamiliar feeling. A cold, quiet calm. "What now?" I asked, my voice steady for the first time in a week. Frank didn't hesitate. "Now, this isn't about hiding anymore," he said, pulling out his phone. "Now, it's about you taking back what's yours. I have an old friend who works at the sheriff's department. Good man, an honest cop. He's close to retirement like us. He'll know exactly what to do." He started to dial, but I put my hand on his arm. "Wait, Frank." He stopped, looking at me, his expression questioning. "Before you call them," I said, my voice low and firm, "there's something I have to do first. I need to face them myself. I owe it to myself. I need them to be looking me in the eye when their world comes crashing down." Frank studied my face for a long moment. Then, he slowly lowered the phone and gave me a single, understanding nod. He got it. This wasn't just about the law anymore. This was about honor. The next morning, for the first time in nearly a week, I shaved. I stood in front of the small, cracked mirror in Frank's bathroom and lathered my face with soap. I looked at the man staring back at me. It was an old man's face, tired and etched with the hard lines of a long life. But something in the eyes was different. The flicker of fear that had been my constant companion was gone. The weary resignation had vanished. In their place, a pilot light of cold, hard anger had been reignited into a steady flame. When I was done, I put on a clean LL Bean flannel shirt, the one with the dark green and blue plaid. It was an old favorite. Martha always said it brought out the color of my eyes. Today, I wasn't a victim hiding in the shadows. I wasn't a refugee. I was Arthur Harrison, and I was going home. On the drive over, Frank and I went over the plan one last time. "I go in first, alone," I said, my voice firm. "You wait at the end of the road. Give me 15 minutes. No matter what you hear, no matter what you think is happening, you wait exactly 15 minutes. Then you call the sheriff and you come straight in." Frank hated it. I could see the worry tightening the lines around his eyes. "Michael's a young man, Arthur. He's stronger than you." "I know he is," I answered, my gaze fixed on the road ahead. "But I'm not going to fight him with strength. I'm going to fight him with the truth." He didn't argue further. He just gave a tight, reluctant nod. He knew he couldn't stop me. This was my battle. I had to be the one to fire the last shot. The truck ate up the familiar miles, rolling past the same fields and split-rail fences I'd looked at for most of my life. There was a time I thought I would die on this land. A quiet death in my own bed after a long, peaceful decline. I never imagined I'd be returning to it like this, like a soldier moving toward an objective on a battlefield that used to be his home. As the peak of my barn roof came into view over the tops of the trees, my heart began to beat a heavy, powerful rhythm. But it wasn't the frantic, panicked drumming of fear. It was the steady, resolute beat of purpose. Frank pulled the truck to a stop behind the cover of the old oak tree. 15 minutes, Arthur," he said, his voice low and serious. I nodded once, pushed the door open, and stepped out onto the dirt road. I didn't look back. I started walking. This time, I didn't sneak around to the back. I walked right up the main path, my boots sure and steady on the gravel. I walked up the porch steps, across the boards I had replaced myself 2 summers ago, and I knocked on my own front door. A few seconds passed. Then the lock clicked, and the door opened. It was Linda. The sequence of emotions that washed over her face was a sight to behold. First, a jolt of pure, slack-jawed surprise. That quickly melted into a wide-eyed panic, which she then tried clumsily to mask with a flash of anger. "Dad, where have you been?" she stammered, her voice a high-pitched, unnatural squeak. "I've come home," I said, my voice perfectly calm, and I walked right past her, into the house. Michael was at the kitchen table, hunched over a stack of papers that looked suspiciously like bank statements. When he saw me, he shot to his feet so fast he knocked his chair over with a loud clatter. "Old man, where the hell have you been?" he roared, his voice a mixture of relief and fury. I didn't answer his question. I didn't even acknowledge it. I just looked him straight in the eye, holding his gaze until he had to look away. "We need to talk," I said, my tone leaving no room for argument. "The 3 of us, in the barn, now." There must have been something in my eyes, something new and unyielding, because after a moment of shocked silence, he gave a short, jerky nod. Linda just stood by the door, pale and speechless. They knew. In that moment, they knew the game was over. I turned and walked out the back door. I didn't check to see if they were following. I knew they would be. We walked across the yard in a dead, oppressive silence. I led them to the barn, the place where all of this had started. The scent of pine and oil was still there, but now it was mingled with the sour smell of deceit. I looked around. They'd done a thorough job. The grate over the ventilation duct was screwed back in place. The area around the water pump was clean. There was no visible trace of the evil they had installed in my sanctuary. They thought they had erased it all. But they forgot one thing. They could remove the wires and the canisters. They could scrub the floors. But they couldn't erase my memory. I turned to face them, my 2 children, standing there in the dusty light of the barn. The storm was about to break. I stood in the center of the workshop, the place where I had taught my son how to hold a hammer and face them. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The words, when they came, were quiet, but they landed with the weight of gravestones. "The chemical canister," I started, my voice even and calm. "Where did you hide it? The one you hooked up to the ventilation system." Michael let out a short, ugly laugh. It was a brittle cracking sound. "What are you talking about, Dad? You're not making any sense. You've been gone for days. You must be exhausted, confused." Linda just stood behind him, her face as white as a sheet. She was never as good at lying as her brother. "And the timer," I continued, my eyes locked on Michael, ignoring his attempts to paint me as a senile old fool. "You were very precise, just a little bit each day, just enough to make a man look like he was falling apart from old age." "You're crazy," Michael snarled, taking a threatening step toward me. "You run off for a week and you come back spouting this nonsense? You've probably been holed up in a bar somewhere." He was trying to flip the script to put me on trial. It was his last desperate play. Linda quickly chimed in, her voice trembling. "He's right, Dad. You need to rest. You've been under a lot of stress." They were putting on their final performance, the one where they played the part of the worried, long-suffering children. But I wasn't in the audience anymore. I just slowly shook my head. "No," I said, my voice cutting through their act. "I'm not confused. I've seen Frank's photographs, and I know," I said, turning my gaze to Linda, "about the little unlabeled glass vial you dropped in the yard." The effect was instantaneous. Linda made a small, choking sound, and her knees seemed to buckle. All the color drained from her face. Michael froze, his mouth half open. The mask of indignant anger shattered, revealing the raw panic beneath. I pressed on, giving them no time to recover. "I also know about the little blue wire you forgot to pull out from behind the ventilation grate. You were in a hurry, weren't you? Cleaning up your mess." A dead, ringing silence filled the barn. The kind of silence that is louder than any scream. It was their confession, written in the air between us. When the words failed him, violence took over. With a guttural roar of pure desperation, Michael lunged at me. He didn't throw a punch. He slammed his entire body into my chest, a brutal, jarring shove. I stumbled backward, the wind knocked out of me, my back cracking hard against the edge of my workbench. Tools scattered, clattering to the concrete floor with a deafening cacophony. The physical pain was a dull, distant thud compared to the agony in my heart. The boy whose hands I had guided, whose fingers I had taught to build and create, was now using that strength to destroy me. "You've ruined everything," he bellowed, his face contorted in a mask of pure rage. "Everything!" He was gathering himself to come at me again, to finish the job, to prove once and for all that the old man who was once his symbol of strength was now just a frail, broken thing. And in that exact moment, a blinding beam of light sliced through the wide-open barn doors, painting the scene in a harsh white glare. It was followed by the unmistakable sound of tires crunching on the gravel driveway and the distant, rising wail of a siren. Frank had kept his word. The 15 minutes were up. 2 uniformed sheriff's deputies stepped into the light, their faces grim, their hands resting on their holsters. Frank was right behind them. They took in the scene in a single sweeping glance. Me, struggling to push myself up from the workbench. Michael, poised in a posture of pure aggression. Linda, sobbing hysterically in a corner, a crumpled mess of guilt and fear. It was all there. A perfect, damning tableau. No more words were needed. They put the cuffs on Michael. The fight went out of him instantly, as if his strings had been cut. All the rage, all the bluster just evaporated, leaving behind a pale, defeated young man. As they led a weeping Linda past me, she couldn't bring herself to look at me. I stood there in the sudden, echoing quiet of my workshop, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Frank walked over and put a steadying hand on my shoulder. He didn't say a word, and neither did I. There was no feeling of triumph, no rush of victory, just a vast, hollow emptiness where my family used to be. I looked down at the floor, at the scattered tools of my trade. I bent down slowly, my back aching, and picked up a heavy pipe wrench. I felt its familiar weight in my palm, the cold, solid steel, a grounding presence. And I noticed, with a distant sense of wonder, that my hand was no longer shaking. In the weeks that followed, the storm passed, and a quiet settled over the farm. Michael and Linda had to face the consequences of their actions. I didn't go to the court hearings. I didn't need to be there to see it. Their story was over. Mine was not. But the quiet in the house wasn't a peaceful one. It was a cold, hollow silence. I'd walk past their empty bedrooms, rooms that once echoed with laughter and teenage arguments, and all that was left were tainted memories. They say time heals all wounds, but that's not entirely true. Some wounds just turn into scars, and you carry them for the rest of your days. This was one of those scars. So I started where my life had always made the most sense, in the barn. I began to clean, but this wasn't just sweeping up sawdust. This was an exorcism. I took my big steel leaf blower and blasted every last speck of dust from every corner and rafter, the roar of the engine a cleansing sound. I wiped down every single tool, feeling the familiar shapes of the wrenches and hammers in my hands, and placed them back in their rightful spots on the wall. I took my belt sander to the top of the workbench, the exact spot where my back had hit, and worked it over for an hour, sanding away the memory of the impact until the wood was as smooth and pale as a new bone. I was reclaiming my space. I was scrubbing away the stain of their betrayal, restoring the sanctity of the one place they could not break. This was my church, and I would not let it be defiled. Frank started coming by most weekends. He never brought up what had happened, not once. Instead, he'd just show up on a Sunday morning with 2 coffees from the diner in town, and we'd get to work on something. One weekend, we replaced a rotten section of the fence line. The next, we gave my old pickup a tune-up, changing out the Pennzoil and putting in a new Fram filter, our hands dark with grease. We didn't talk much. We didn't have to. We'd just work, side by side, in a comfortable, productive silence. His presence was a quiet affirmation that I wasn't alone. We were men of a certain generation, one that believes friendship is a thing you build with your hands, not with your words. Looking back, I realize Frank saved my life more than once. He saved me when he found the truth in the barn, of course. But maybe more importantly, he saved me from the crushing loneliness that came after. He saw something was wrong, and he didn't turn away. It makes me think a lot about the men I've known my whole life, the friends I see at the hardware store or the VFW hall. It makes me wonder, have you ever looked at an old friend, a buddy you've known for years, and just had a gut feeling that something wasn't right, even if they were telling you everything was fine? What did you do? I hope you'll share your story in the comments, because sometimes just one phone call, just one question, can change everything. One afternoon, Frank brought his own boy over, a good kid in his late teens. I was showing him how to use the wood lathe, how to feel the grain and guide the chisel just right. And as I watched the boy's face light up when the rough block of wood began to take on a smooth, elegant shape, an idea began to form in my mind. My own children were lost to me. I had no one to pass my skills down to anymore. But that didn't mean my legacy had to die. I decided right then and there. I would start a small, free woodworking class right here in this barn for any of the local kids who wanted to learn. I could teach them how to make something beautiful and lasting out of a raw piece of timber. I could teach them about patience, about the quiet dignity of honest labor, about the pride that comes from creating something with your own two hands. This farm, this house, I see them differently now. They are no longer my legacy. A true legacy isn't something you can list in a will. It's not about property or bank accounts. It's in the hands you've shaken and the knowledge you've shared. It's in the honor you've held on to, even in the face of the ugliest betrayals. My children tried to take my life and steal my property. But there was one thing they could never touch. They could never take the soul of an old woodworker. And that soul, here in this quiet, dusty barn, has finally found its peace.